London, January 31st, 1606. A cold morning bites at the flesh. The sky hangs heavy above Old Palace Yard, where thousands have gathered, not to witness justice, but to feast on it. At the center stands a man whose name will one day become a mask. Guy Fawkes, Catholic soldier, traitor to the crown, conspirator in the Gunpowder plot. The scaffold has been built taller than usual, the rope adjusted with expert calculation. The knives, glinting in the winter sun, have been sharpened to glide through human flesh like parchment. Everything has been prepared for a performance, one designed to break not just the body, but the will of anyone watching. And the crowd wants blood. They paid to be here. Merchants brought food carts. Noblemen reserved the best views. For them, this is theater. For King James I, it's a message. This is what happens when you defy the Protestant crown. But something is different. As the executioner reaches for the rope, Guy Fawkes doesn't look broken. His body is ruined, his hands crushed from days on the rack, his shoulders dislocated, his signature barely a scratch. And yet something in his eyes defies the ritual. And then he jumps. He leaps from the scaffold before the executioner can tighten the noose. In that moment, time fractures. Bones snap. The crowd gasps. The carefully choreographed execution has been stolen in one breathless instant. The scream the crown wanted never comes. Instead, a silence more deafening than any cry. He died instantly, neck broken, dignity intact. And just like that, the king's grand spectacle, months in the making, collapsed. I've spent years studying what happened next, what they did to his corpse, how the king rewrote the story, how that one leap changed British law, and the meaning of justice itself. Because this wasn't just the death of a traitor, it was the birth of something far more dangerous. Stick with me. At minute 8, we'll reveal how one fall rewrote the rules of execution forever. But first, we need to go back to the night they found him with enough gunpowder to blow England off the map. London in 1605 was a kingdom ready to ignite. The tension wasn't political, it was religious. To be Catholic in Protestant England was to live with suspicion on your back and a prayer for survival on your lips. And no one knew that better than Guy Fawkes. Born in York and raised under the shadow of persecution, Fawkes didn't simply grow into rebellion, he trained for it. By the time he was 30, he had fought alongside Catholic forces in Spain and learned the intricacies of siege warfare, and most dangerously, explosives. Not a rogue with a grudge. Guy Fawkes was a soldier with a mission, and the mission was nothing short of apocalyptic. The idea wasn't new. Catholic resistance had simmered for decades under the surface. But the scale, the audacity of the Gunpowder plot was unprecedented. It wasn't just about killing the king. It was about erasing the entire Protestant establishment in one thunderous second. The plan was deceptively simple. Smuggle 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to reduce Parliament to rubble, into a cellar directly beneath the House of Lords. Detonate them on the opening day of Parliament when King James I, his heir, his court, and virtually every Protestant lord would be gathered in one place. One match in centuries of Protestant rule would vanish in fire and smoke. At the center of this conspiracy stood Robert Catesby, the aristocratic mastermind. But even he knew they needed more than devotion. They needed precision. That's where Guy Fawkes came in. Catesby didn't just trust Fawkes, he needed him. Fawkes' experience with munitions, his ability to move undetected, and his absolute commitment to the Catholic cause made him the perfect agent. While the other conspirators maneuvered politically, Fawkes took on the deadliest role, the man who would light the fuse. In May 1605, Fawkes began making regular visits to a rented cellar beneath the House of Lords. Disguised as John Johnson, a servant of a fellow conspirator, he worked by torchlight, stacking barrel after barrel of powder beneath the floor of English power. The explosive cache was massive, so massive that if it had gone off, it would have not only killed the king and Parliament, but shattered every window in Westminster and sent tremors through the Thames. They were days, hours away from rewriting the nation's history. But someone talked. To this day, historians still debate the infamous Monteagle letter, An anonymous note delivered to a Catholic peer warning him to stay away from Parliament that morning. A warning? A betrayal? No one knows. But it found its way into the hands of King James's Security Council, and within days the plot began to unravel. In the early hours of November 5th, a search party descended into the cellar. There, crouched in the shadows, surrounded by barrels and fuses, was Guy Fawkes, armed, calm, ready to strike. What they discovered wasn't just gunpowder. It was the first terrorist cell of the modern era. And in Fawkes' silence, his refusal to name his co-conspirators, they found something else: resolve. He was arrested, shackled, and dragged to the tower. But he had already become something more than a conspirator. He was now the living embodiment of English fear, a Catholic with nothing to lose. What if he had succeeded? What if, in one explosion, England's monarchy, government, and future had been erased? That's the horror that haunted King James. And the reason why Fawkes wouldn't simply be executed. He would be unmade. His body would become a message. And that message needed to be written not in ink, but in flesh. But before that message could be carved, they had to break him. Mind, spirit, and bone. And in the torture chambers of the tower, the story turns darker. They found him crouched in the shadows, eyes fixed, fuse ready. Guy Fawkes wasn't running. He wasn't begging. He was waiting. Armed with a slow match, surrounded by 36 barrels of gunpowder, more than enough to annihilate the Palace of Westminster, he was prepared to light the future on fire. But fate moved faster. When Sir Thomas Knivett's guards stormed the vault beneath Parliament in the early hours of November 5th, 1605, they didn't find chaos. They found discipline. Fawkes, ever the soldier, greeted his captors with a calm defiance that stunned them. He gave a false name, John Johnson, and insisted he was merely watching over the coal. But the evidence spoke louder than his lips. The gunpowder, expertly concealed behind firewood and iron bars. The matches, the fuses, the Catholic devotional items in his coat. There was no room for doubt. This man had come to end kings. They shackled him on the spot and marched him straight to the Tower of London. The king, now roused from his chambers and briefed on the chilling discovery, reacted with icy fury. His words were precise. The gentler tortures shall be first used, and God willing, he shall be made to speak. The phrase gentler tortures would come to define the Tudor approach to interrogation. Pain applied like poetry, measured, escalating, unforgettable. Guy Fawkes was not just a prisoner. He was now Exhibit A in a national trauma. The English people wanted answers. The crown wanted revenge. And the tower was built to deliver both. The interrogation began with the manacles, his arms twisted behind his back, suspended from iron shackles. For hours, his full body weight pulled at dislocating joints, driving fire through bone. When silence remained, they brought in the rack. The rack was no myth. It was a brutal wooden frame with ropes attached to the wrists and ankles. With each turn of the wheel, limbs stretched, joints cracked, sinews tore. It wasn't just about pain, it was about deconstruction, turning a man into meat, breaking him until his screams became language. Fawkes resisted for days. He named no names. He signed no confessions. But torture has a way of rewriting even the strongest minds. His signature, preserved in the National Archives, shows the transition. The first is a confident Guido, his Catholic name. The next is a trembling line, barely legible. By the third day, his hands were mangled wreckage. The letters looped like the scrawl of a child learning to write, or a man whose bones had been unknit. The confession that broke Guy Fawkes wasn't spoken. It was signed in blood, pain, and ink, and it changed England forever. As the names poured out, Thomas Wintour, Robert Catesby, Ambrose Rookwood, the government pounced. Raids swept across England. Conspirators were hunted down, shot, and captured. But the crown had what it needed, not just a victory, but a narrative. And that narrative required a villain, a traitor so ruthless, so monstrous, that his death would need to be as theatrical as his crime. So the sentence was passed. Guy Fawkes would be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most savage penalty reserved for traitors. But that wasn't the end of it. The tower wasn't done. In the weeks before his execution, they rotated tortures, alternating between physical destruction and psychological warfare. The scavenger's daughter, a device that crushed the body into itself until the ribs cracked, was introduced after his spirit began to flicker back. Then the manacles again. Then the rack. Between sessions, he was thrown into a stone cell, unheated, unfed, barely human. They weren't just punishing a man. They were breaking a symbol. The goal was not execution. It was transformation. They wanted to turn him from martyr to monster, from rebel to regret. And yet, he never cried out for mercy. He confessed, yes, but he never recanted. Even as his body gave out, his eyes told another story. A story that, in its final chapter, would horrify even the executioners themselves. Because the punishment the king had in store made torture look merciful. January 31st, 1606. The air in London was sharp, thick with fog and anticipation. From every corner of the city, crowds poured into Old Palace Yard. They weren't just coming to see a man die. They were coming to witness a ritual, something engineered to satisfy fear, vengeance, and power all at once. Because what awaited Guy Fawkes was no ordinary execution. It was a sentence reserved for England's worst nightmares: hanging, drawing, and quartering. And it had been carefully choreographed by royal decree, down to the height of the gallows and the sharpness of the blades. The punishment began long before the scaffold. Fawkes and his surviving co-conspirators, Thomas Wintour, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes, were strapped to wooden hurdles, dragged for miles through London's stone streets. It wasn't just transportation, it was humiliation. Blood already soaked through their garments. Rotten fruit and manure flew from the crowd. Their bodies, starved, broken by weeks of torture, bounced like rags across the cobblestones. And then came the platform. Built higher than usual, its wooden planks gleamed wet under a gray sky. The executioner stood hooded, silent, surrounded by the crown's finest steel. The crowd, commoners and noblemen alike, leaned in. They weren't here to blink. They were here to remember. Each man was to be hanged just long enough to approach unconsciousness, then cut down, still alive, still aware. Then came the blade. The abdomen would be sliced open with surgical care. The intestines pulled slowly from the body and burned in front of the victim, often while the heart was still beating. This was not justice. It was anatomical theater. Then the final act, quartering. Arms and legs removed one by one, sometimes with axes, sometimes with saws. The remains were paraded through the city, heads impaled on spikes, bodies scattered as a warning. But Guy Fawkes watched all of it. He watched Wintour scream until his voice cracked. He watched Rookwood's body convulse as his entrails turned to smoke. He heard bones split and blood hiss against flame. And he knew he was next. And then the impossible. He robbed the crown of its masterpiece. As the executioner adjusted the rope, positioning it with cruel precision, Fawkes, legs barely holding him up, spine shattered by torture, did the unthinkable. He jumped. His neck snapped instantly on impact. There were no screams, no drawing, no quartering while alive, just silence. The crowd gasped in disbelief. Some murmured in disappointment. Others, strangely, applauded. The crown had planned a demonstration. What they got was defiance. Fawkes's body lay twisted on the cold platform. But even in death, the law had to be satisfied. And so the executioner, faced with a corpse instead of a conscious victim, proceeded anyway. His abdomen was sliced open, his lifeless organs tossed into the fire, his limbs hacked off with mechanical finality. But the pageantry was hollow, the spectacle ruined. The man they called a traitor had, in one desperate leap, reclaimed control. He didn't just cheat death, he cheated the system. He denied the crown its performance, its lesson, its fear. And what came next wasn't justice, it was panic. Because what do you do when your villain dies his own way? The crowd had come to see agony. They expected hours of staged torment, grotesque choreography that would etch royal vengeance into memory. But instead, what they witnessed was a flicker of resistance so swift, so final, it shattered the script. In one desperate motion, Guy Fawkes leapt from the scaffold. His broken body hit the cobblestone below with a sickening snap. His neck was fractured. Death came instantly. No screams, no ritual, no satisfaction for the crown. The silence that followed wasn't reverence, it was shock. What was supposed to be an example had turned into a question. The very machinery of punishment, refined through centuries of spectacle, had been rendered useless by one defiant act. And the crown wasn't ready. Guards scrambled to secure the corpse. The executioner hesitated, then proceeded, his movements now mechanical, ceremonial. Fawkes's abdomen was slit open. His entrails were tossed into the flames. His limbs were severed and his remains divided, destined for spikes above bridges and city gates. But the heart of the ritual was gone, the message obliterated. The man who had failed to destroy Parliament had, with his final act, destroyed the performance that was supposed to destroy him. And here's the twist that terrified the monarchy the most. Fawkes's death wasn't a defeat, it was a prototype. In the days that followed, panic gripped the English court. King James I, expecting a triumphant narrative of punishment and deterrence, found himself facing a folktale of courage. The people weren't sure what to believe. Some branded Fawkes a coward, afraid of pain. Others whispered of heroism, that in that jump, he'd chosen dignity over disgrace, control over surrender. Pamphlets poured into the streets. Some condemned the conspirators as demonic traitors. Others reimagined them as noble rebels, crushed by tyranny. The church scrambled. Protestant preachers condemned the act as suicidal heresy, proof of damnation. Meanwhile, Catholic sympathizers quietly circulated the idea that Fawkes had died a martyr, his soul freed before his enemies could desecrate his body. Inside Parliament, the mood was even darker. The spectacle had failed, and worse, future traitors might now follow Fawkes's example. So they acted quickly. Legislation was passed to modify the scaffolds, no more leaping. Ropes would be tightened. Guards would hold prisoners until the precise moment. No one else would be allowed to cheat justice. Executioners were retrained. Witness protocols restructured. The entire system of capital punishment was recalibrated, not to increase mercy, but to prevent defiance. And still the story spread. Across taverns and ports, along trade roads and churchyards, the legend of the man who leapt grew louder than the king's decree. Because what Fawkes proved in his final second was that even the most monstrous machine of justice had a blind spot. Even the crown could be robbed of its power. And that was the true threat. Not the gunpowder, not the failed explosion, but the possibility that others might follow, not the plot, but the leap. The leap didn't just kill a man, it shook a kingdom. Guy Fawkes was meant to be an emblem of treason's fate, a living sacrifice torn apart for all of England to watch. Instead, he became something far more dangerous, a man who refused to play his part, a man who died on his own terms. The crown was furious. King James I had orchestrated a performance of divine justice. Fawkes's execution was to be a lesson, etched into public memory, seared into the flesh of the nation's enemies. But instead, he got chaos. A dead body before the ropes tightened, a crowd stunned, and worse, an idea unleashed. If one man could rob the state of its theater, what stopped others from trying? The monarchy responded the only way it knew how, with control. Immediately, royal officials restructured the protocols for capital punishment. Scaffolds were redesigned to prevent movement. Platforms were shortened to minimize fall velocity. Guards were ordered to physically restrain prisoners until the noose was fully in place. Executioners were trained not just in technique, but in containment. Every movement was rehearsed, every second accounted for. The act of dying would be fully state-owned. But it was too late. The narrative was already out of the palace yard, and it couldn't be burned, tortured, or quartered. Pamphlets appeared in every corner of England. Some declared Fawkes a coward, too weak to face justice. Others whispered reverently of his final act, portraying it as bravery in its purest form. Preachers railed against him from pulpits, branding his leap as blasphemous and cowardly. Yet in the same breath, Catholic sympathizers passed hushed stories of martyrdom from one household to another. What was meant to be closure became controversy. The real threat wasn't that Fawkes jumped. It was that his jump gave people something the Crown feared most: interpretation. The Crown, sensing its grip on the narrative slipping, turned to propaganda. Royal scribes rewrote the official records, emphasizing the justice served, omitting the fall. Court artists depicted Fawkes bound and broken, ignoring the moment he took control. And in the House of Commons, the word coward was affixed to his name with institutional insistence. But word of mouth proved more potent than parchment. Travelers brought versions of the story to the countryside. Each retelling grew bolder, more symbolic. Fawkes's fall became a statement, not an accident. Some claimed he whispered prayers as he leapt. Others imagined him spitting on the executioner. The truth became irrelevant. The legend had taken root, and legends, unlike conspiracies, don't need to succeed to survive. Inside Parliament, fear metastasized into legislation. New treason laws were passed, making it a crime to speak favorably of the plotters. Scaffolds across the nation were modified. Executioners were instructed to anticipate suicide attempts, to tie prisoners down if necessary. The Crown wasn't just punishing bodies anymore. It was defending its narrative. Because what haunted them wasn't the barrels of gunpowder or the bloodstained confessions. It was that in a kingdom built on spectacle, Guy Fawkes had stolen the spotlight and walked out of the performance. By force, the execution was supposed to end him. Guy Fawkes should have faded into history as a failed terrorist, his name muttered in sermons and forgotten in the ashes. But something strange happened in the centuries that followed. He didn't disappear, he transformed. At first, the Crown clung to control. Within weeks of the failed gunpowder plot, Parliament passed the Observance of 5th November Act, mandating an annual day of Thanksgiving. Churches rang bells, bonfires were lit, and sermons preached divine deliverance. It was a holiday not to celebrate Fawkes, but to condemn him. Effigies were burned. Children stuffed old clothes with straw, sewed on crude masks, and paraded their guys through the streets, shouting for pennies to burn the guy. It was state-sanctioned scorn, a ritual of humiliation, and for a time it worked. But something strange began to shift in the 18th century. As England changed, industrially, socially, politically, so did Guy Fawkes' night. The religious edge dulled, the anti-Catholic venom faded. What remained was the ritual, bonfires, fireworks, effigies, but the meaning began to blur. By the 19th century, Fawkes had become less of a villain and more of a folk figure. In the slums of London and the mills of Manchester, where workers lived under choking poverty and political powerlessness, Guy Fawkes was remembered less as a traitor and more as a man who tried to strike back. The man who once symbolized treason was now becoming a symbol of resistance. The real turning point came centuries later, not in Parliament, but in a comic book. In 1982, writer Alan Moore and artist David Lloyd released V for Vendetta, a dystopian graphic novel where a masked vigilante named V wages war against a totalitarian British state. His face, a stylized, eerie version of Guy Fawkes. It was intentional. Moore wasn't just choosing a historical rebel, he was reclaiming the idea of rebellion. V didn't represent Fawkes the man, he represented what Fawkes had become, a myth that outlived the punishment. In 2005, the film adaptation of V for Vendetta launched the mask into global culture, and this time it stuck. Suddenly, Guy Fawkes wasn't just on bonfires. He was on posters, billboards, and most of all, faces. Hacktivist group Anonymous adopted the mask as their signature look. Protesters in London, Cairo, Hong Kong, and New York wore it to challenge banks, governments, and police. The image became a global shorthand for dissent, for standing up against systemic power. Guy Fawkes, once drawn and quartered as a traitor, had become a brand of revolution. And yet, most of those who wear the mask know little of the man beneath it. The broken hands, the failed detonation, the silent leap from the scaffold. The layers of meaning have shifted with every generation, each peeling back and revealing another version. To some, he's a coward who avoided punishment. To others, he's a martyr of faith. To millions, he's a ghost in a grinning mask, anonymous, eternal, enraged. But perhaps the real legacy isn't about who Fawkes was, but what he left behind. Not barrels, not flames, but a question. What is justice? Who decides the price of rebellion? And when the state stages a spectacle of suffering, does resisting the final act make you a hero? He didn't blow up Parliament. He didn't bring down the monarchy. And in the end, he died alone, brutalized, broken, buried in pieces. But somehow, he won the legacy. Because centuries later, we don't burn his name with shame. We wear it, we chant it, we carry it into the streets as a banner of defiance. Guy Fawkes, the failed bomber, became the face of protest across the globe. From anonymous hackers to global uprisings, his image now signals resistance to injustice, corruption, and unchecked power. And here's the irony the Crown never saw coming. The man they tried to erase with violence became immortal because he chose his own ending, not theirs. Maybe we've misunderstood him all along. Maybe Guy Fawkes wasn't just a traitor, but a warning, a question, a mirror. What would you have done on that scaffold? Was he a terrorist or a man who stood up when his world silenced people like him? Comment below, hero or villain? What does the mask mean to you? And if you want more stories like this, of icons, rebels, and those crushed by power but reborn in history, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. The fire Fawkes tried to light, it didn't die in that cellar, it's still burning.